What's up troops, it's me TheTacticalBrit and I'm here today with a brand new Tales from the Battlefield. Now many of you here will probably have watched the most recent successful war sort of film in my opinion, Fury. Now if you haven't, Fury is starring Brad Pitt and it's about a tank crew which essentially holds down a shit ton of enemies during World War II. They become trapped, their tank becomes inoperable and they essentially fend off a large enemy German force for an extended duration of time. Now, you may be wondering why exactly I'm talking to you about a World War II film, considering this is about World War I. What many people don't know is a very similar, if not even more incredible story occurred during World War I to a 9-man strong tank crew who had to hold off German forces for 3 days and 3 nights. After becoming trapped in their own tank, they had to hold off against an extreme amount of enemy opponents, mostly Germans. They had to hold off against sniper fire, mortar shell fire, artillery fire, and even fire from their own allies. Now the general military standard at this time was that if a tank had been overrun, they didn't want the Germans salvaging it for their technology. So as a result, it was pretty common practice to mortar and destroy your own tanks if that had happened. So with the impending doom of being mortared by their own friendlies, this German tank had to find a way to survive for 3 days and 3 nights, alert the friendlies that they weren't overrun just yet, and even hold out against excessive numbers of enemy forces whilst being trapped in a tank, running low on food and running low on water, and even at one point being forced to drink from their own radiator because the tank was no longer moving and they were simply just running out of water to drink. This infamous event is now known as the Siege of Fray Bentos, but how exactly did this go down, how did the tank get its name, and what actually happened to the crew after these 3 days and 3 nights? So, to start off with, the 9-strong crew of the F-41 Mark IV tank were in pretty much their first ever combat situation in this brand new machine. They were leading an attack along with 7 other tanks which was launched on August 22nd, 1917, and their target was a series of small farm buildings which had been heavily fortified by the Germans, but the machines that they were using swiftly ran into problems during the combat. The offensive was part of the Passchendaele campaign, which was infamously remembered for having notoriously muddy conditions, of which 7 machines became bogged down and broken, and many of which were even destroyed entirely by the excessive levels of mud. The last tank standing was the F-41, otherwise more formally known as the Fray Bentos, after a tin meat firm based in Britain who had supplied troops across World War I. Now this was able to stay on course until it had reached a strong point. Machine gun fire struck a half-closed visor and injured both officers on board, Captain Donald Richardson and 2nd Lieutenant George Hill. Now Hill, who was driving the vehicle, actually fell and knocked the throttle, causing the tank to surge into a crater where it became stuck. Now as it sunk deeper into the mud, it became apparent that the 2 guns on either side were rendered entirely useless. One of them was pointing towards the ground and the other one pointing straight into the sky. One of the crew named Private Brady decided that he would jump outside and try and use the unleash beam to try and free the tanks when they became stuck, but this is eventually where they became aware of their rather desolate situation, as Private Brady was instantly killed by gunfire on the exposed tank, and he actually died, leaving his body and the wooden beam trapping those who were inside the tank by closing off the main door and making it nigh on impossible to actually leave the vehicle. Another private attempted to leave the vehicle, but this was not allowed by Richardson. Now this actually marked the beginning of the Siege of Fray Bentos. Shell and mortar fire began to rain down on those inside, and eventually injuries within the actual vehicle itself began amounting. Now the tank's position in the crater had actually made it somewhat beneficial to them because it was harder for the German gunners to repeatedly score direct hits. Now the British crew were only able to take the fight to the Germans using a single Lewis gun to break up 2 counterattacks, which eventually the Germans attempted on the British. Richardson knew that eventually the British would shell the tanks themselves in order to stop it falling into German hands. So after dark, one of the crew, Sergeant Misson, volunteered to go out onto the men's lines and try and get the word through that the machine was still manned. Now the battle was being fought and Richardson wanted to stay in no man's land in order to cause the enemy positions trouble, but at that night, of which Misson was supposed to go out and warn the Allies that this tank was still operable, the Germans attacked. They were detected by a Private Maury, who opened fire with the Lewis gun, and one German was actually able to open the door and throw in a stick grenade or a statular charge before he was shot by Richardson. This was one of multiple attempts to destroy the tank with explosives, but the British were able to drive off the Germans with small arms fire, but conditions in the tank progressively worsened. Now, Bud died of his injuries before dawn. Another soldier, Lance Corporal Binley, had part of his entire scalp removed by a shell splinter, and entirely the men's water had run out, forcing them to start drinking from the tank's radiator. Now, they attempted to maintain morale by stating that they were causing the Germans problems, and in actuality they really were. Multiple German counterattacks had been completely defused, and at this point in time, despite the crew inside being either injured or dead, they were actually stopping the Germans from progressing any further than they had advanced, due to the possibility of them being killed. And at one point the Lewis gun which they were using had actually stopped working, and they actually began using sniper rifles, causing other groups that were attempting to counterattack from the German side to scatter completely. Their intervention on these counterattacks brought a new wave of mortar fire and shell fire, and after nightfall another assault on the attack. Now, every crew saw the men approach from the direction of the British lines during this attack in the night, but they weren't sure if they were friend or foe. But as this was happening, the British fired multiple flares into the air, which made them realise that these were Germans attempting to attack their position, of which they eventually fought off, and they were only 20 yards away from the tank. Now, machine gun fire from British positions actually helped off drive the entire attack completely, and from that point forward, regular flares were sent up by the British to stop any further assaults. Now, as the third day progressed, injuries continued. It was reported that many inside had been severely damaged by shrapnel, some of which having incredibly deep cuts and bleeding quite heavily. A single crew member named Maury was the only one who was uninjured, but rations had eventually been exhausted and ammunitions for revolvers, rifles and Lewis guns were eventually running low. The crew were finally hit with an ultimatum. Although some of them had already died and many were injured, the discussion was whether or not they should try and escape or not. Now, eventually they voted after coming to an understanding that if they remained in the tank for any longer, they would eventually die. Now, after a discussion between the two officers, Hill and Richardson, they had eventually decided that they should try and escape in the middle of the night. Miraculously, after leaving their vehicle and escaping, there was actually no German intervention or no German fire at all, and it was believed that they did not see them escape the vehicle during the night. Now, all of the surviving crew actually made it back to the British lines, approximately 72 hours after the assault had first begun. When they got back to the British position, Richardson discovered that his men had even brought the Lewis guns with them, as standing orders demanded, and the tank did not need to be destroyed. So essentially we have an entire crew here who had managed to hold off an onslaught of enemy opponents for 72 hours, including mortar fire, sniper fire, and general small arms fire, and even potential grenade attacks as well. Now, the Frey Bentos crew was actually awarded 2 military crosses, 2 Distinguished Conduct Medals, and 4 military medals in general. This was the most ever awarded to one tank crew during any action of World War I. So if any of you have watched Fury and you're picturing that scene in your head right now of those guys holding off that entire onslaught of German opponents in World War II, imagine that but about 10 times worse and being dug in about, I don't know, a couple of meters worth of mud, starving, running out of water, most of which were bleeding, and being shelled by your own friendlies for a certain duration of time until they realised that you were alive. Which is pretty incredible if you think about it, and almost more incredible that some of the people in this thing actually survived, and I believe it was around sort of like 6 or 7 in total who had actually made it back, which is quite an amazing statistic within itself. So guys, that's about it for today's Tales from the Battlefield. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you do, leave a like down below and do leave comments as well. Make sure you have any statistics, throw them in. If you have any just general thoughts about the video, feel free to throw it in. And if you want to suggest any videos, I honestly advise that you do. If you have any stories that sound interesting, make sure you put them down below, because this story today, which I'm telling you, was actually picked up from our comment section, which was pretty great to see. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon in another video.